The sound of waves drifts through the darkness, soft and endless. A hush lies over the horizon, broken only by the sigh of the tide and the distant echo of gulls. The moonlight trembles on the water's surface, a ribbon of silver that stretches far beyond sight. Somewhere between the vastness of sea and sky, the past breathes again. You can almost hear it in the whispering wind, the memory of sails, the groan of ancient timbers, the rhythm of 1,000 oars cutting through the water. Beneath the stillness of this night lies the heartbeat of a forgotten empire, one that once ruled the ocean and was later swallowed whole by it. Imagine drifting now, gently, across an open sea that glimmers beneath a field of stars. The air is cool and scented with salt. In the distance, a faint glow touches the horizon, not the sun, but the memory of firelight, the shimmer of torches that once burned on the decks of mighty ships. Those ships carried explorers, merchants, warriors, and dreamers. Their sails, tall and white, were like wings unfurled against the unknown. They conquered distances no one had dared to cross. They traced the edges of the world when maps were nothing more than rough sketches and rumors. And now, only the ocean remembers them. It is strange how the sea keeps its secrets. The waves that kiss the shore tonight are the same waters that once carried fleets, that bore the weight of empires and watched them vanish. Every ripple is a reflection of time, every gust of wind a whisper from centuries past. Somewhere below, beneath layers of silt and coral, rest the bones of ships that once ruled these depths, ships that carried gold, silk, spices, and dreams of dominion. The sea does not forget even when humankind does. You can almost hear it, the creak of wood, the snap of a rope, the low murmur of voices carried across the water. Picture the glow of lanterns swinging gently from the masts, their reflections trembling on the waves like ghostly stars. Picture the sailors staring into the night, guided by constellations that felt like promises. They believed the ocean could be tamed. They believed the horizon was a door, not a warning. Their empire rose from that belief, an empire built not on land or stone, but on movement, daring, and the endless blue beneath their feet. In the beginning, it was not an empire at all. It was a handful of fishermen setting out in fragile boats, their nets heavy with hope more than catch. The coastline they called home was rugged, windswept, and poor. Yet from those shores came a people with salt in their blood and the sea in their souls. They learned its moods, its tempers, its quiet patience. They learned that the sea could take as easily as it could give, and that survival demanded respect as much as courage. It was this understanding that would one day give birth to greatness, not through conquest at first, but through curiosity. The stars above those early sailors were their only map. The wind was their compass. They watched the flight of birds, the drift of currents, the color of the water to know where they were. Slowly they ventured farther. Each voyage carried risk, yet also discovery, a new island, a new trade, a new story to bring home. The sea became their teacher, and every wave carried a lesson. When storms came, they learned to bend with the wind instead of fighting it. When the sky cleared, they learned to trust in their craft and the steady pull of the tide. In time, they built ships not of simple wood, but of pride and purpose. Their hulls grew stronger, their sails broader. The sound of their hammers echoed through coastal towns as shipyards sprang to life. The empire's heartbeat began here, in the rhythm of creation, in the scent of tar and oak and salt air. Every vessel that slid into the water was more than wood and canvas. It was a promise to the future. A promise that no horizon would remain unexplored. But tonight, as the waves murmur and the world grows still, all that remains of that promise is the memory of movement. The ocean, vast and timeless, cradles those memories gently. Somewhere out there, beneath the deep blue silence, the remnants of that empire sleep. Barnacles cling to forgotten anchors. Coral grows over shattered figureheads. The sea keeps them hidden, not out of cruelty, but out of reverence. For the ocean remembers every triumph, every fall, and every whisper of human ambition that dared to challenge it. Drift further now. Listen closely. The sound of the waves becomes softer, more rhythmic, like the breath of something ancient and alive. Each crest and trough seems to tell a story. You can sense it, the rise of a kingdom built upon the sea, the shimmering power of trade routes stretching across continents, and the subtle pride of those who believed they had mastered the waters. Yet the ocean was never theirs to rule. It only allowed them to believe it for a while. The night deepens. The stars shimmer like scattered coins across the black surface of the water. Their reflections ripple and distort with every movement of the tide. In this stillness, you can feel the presence of time itself, vast, circular, and patient. The sea has seen empires come and go. It has witnessed the rise of sails and the silence of wrecks. It has carried explorers into glory and swallowed them into myth. To the ocean, all human endeavor is a momentary spark, bright and beautiful, but destined to fade. And yet, it is that spark, the courage to venture into the unknown, that defines the story you are about to hear. As dawn approaches, a thin line of light spreads across the horizon. The water glows softly, turning from black to silver, from silver to gold. The world begins to breathe again. Somewhere beneath the gentle surface lies an empire once alive with the sound of bells, laughter, and song. Its ports were filled with the clamor of trade, its ships with treasures from across the earth. But now, it sleeps beneath the waves, its walls of coral, its roads of sand, its temples lit only by shafts of sunlight piercing the depths. The ocean gives and the ocean takes. For every empire it has lifted upon its waves, it has also reclaimed in silence. The story of the one that ruled the ocean only to be consumed by it is not merely a tale of history, it is a reflection of humanity itself. It is about ambition and loss, glory and humility, the fragile balance between creation and destruction. It reminds us that nothing, no matter how mighty, escapes the pull of time and tide. As the final traces of moonlight fade, and the morning sea stretches endlessly before you, imagine standing at the edge of that vanished world. The waves touch your feet, cold and familiar. The air tastes of salt and memory. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, the ghosts of ships drift eternally, their sails whispering to the wind. They are not gone, only changed, folded into the ocean's vast memory. The empire may have been swallowed, but its story still rises with every tide. And tonight, as you listen, it begins again. It began on a shore that the world had long forgotten. A jagged line of cliffs rose above restless waters, and beyond them lay a patchwork of villages clinging stubbornly to life. The sea was both friend and foe. It fed them, yet it also swallowed their boats without mercy. Salt clung to everything, to the air, to their skin, to the very timbers of their homes. These early people did not know they would one day forge an empire. All they knew was survival, and the sea was the only path to it. Mourning in those villages was a ritual of resilience. The men pushed their narrow boats into the surf while women mended nets on the shore. Children gathered shells or stared out at the horizon, their imaginations carried away by the endless blue. The world beyond that horizon was a mystery, yet it called to them. Some said it was a call from the gods, others from the ancestors, but for most, it was simply curiosity, the hunger to see what lay beyond the reach of the known. The first voyages were humble. Small wooden boats, their hulls darkened by tar, creaked as they met the waves. The sailors carried little more than hope and courage. Their hands were rough from ropes and salt, their faces burned by the wind. They measured direction not with compasses, but with instinct, the stars, the flight of birds, the rhythm of the currents. Each journey was a gamble between discovery and disappearance. Yet every time one of those fragile boats returned, laden with new fish, new shells, or strange stories of distant shores, the people listened with widening eyes. In those stories, the idea of greatness was born. Word spread along the coast of a place where the sea yielded more fish, where the sand shimmered with fragments of pearl, where strangers with painted sails traded metals for salt and cloth. Soon, the villagers began to build sturdier boats, to test deeper waters, and to form alliances with neighboring settlements. Their skill in reading the ocean grew into a craft that others began to respect, then fear. Generations passed, and the coastline changed. Simple huts gave way to wooden docks and stone harbors. Markets appeared where once there were only stretches of sand. Traders from distant lands came seeking the rare shells, salt, and cured fish that these coastal people had mastered. What began as survival had become prosperity, and prosperity had a way of kindling ambition. At night, the elders gathered around fires, their voices carrying through the salty wind. They spoke of building ships that could cross the great waters and touch the edges of the earth. They dreamed of islands rich with spice, of lands where gold gleamed in riverbeds, of cities with towers that touched the clouds. The ocean was no longer a boundary, it was a road. And the road was waiting. The first true fleets were born in the hush before dawn. Shipwrights worked by lamplight, their hammers echoing across the quiet bays. The scent of resin and wood shavings mingled with the cool sea air. Each vessel they built was larger, stronger, and more beautiful than the one before. The people gathered to watch as the ships were pushed into the tide, their sails unfurling like wings. There was pride in those moments, pride in knowing they had turned fear into mastery, chaos into rhythm. The rise of their maritime power began not with war, but with wonder. They sailed to nearby islands and discovered new foods, new plants, and strange animals. They returned with colored stones, with spices that burned the tongue and perfumes that lingered like dreams. Each voyage stretched the map of their world wider, and with each return, the empire's pulse grew stronger. Soon, their ships ventured farther still, past the sight of land. The ocean that once frightened them now became their inheritance. They read its moods like language, the shifting hues of the waves, the tilt of the clouds, the subtle voice of the wind. The sailors learned to trust the sea as one might trust a living being. It tested them, punished them, rewarded them. In time, they began to believe they were chosen by it. Back on shore, their villages swelled into towns and towns into cities. Docks stretched like fingers into the deep. The clang of metal and the call of merchants filled the air. Markets overflowed with goods from across the waters. Fabrics dyed in colors unseen before, oils that glimmered in the light, spices that filled the air with warmth and mystery. Wealth began to change them. Houses grew taller, their walls painted with symbols of the sea. Priests declared that the ocean favored their people, that its depths held secrets meant only for them. And perhaps it was true. For no other people seemed to understand the waves as they did. They began to name the winds, to map the stars, to chart the currents. Their navigators were revered like prophets, their shipbuilders honored like kings. The ocean, once infinite and unknowable, had become their dominion. It was as though the sea itself bent to their will. But beneath that growing confidence lingered a shadow, a subtle awareness that the sea gave nothing freely. Every voyage carried risk, and sometimes entire fleets vanished into the mist, never to return. When storms claimed the ships, the people mourned but also whispered that the ocean was testing their devotion. They built temples at the water's edge, offered sacrifices to the restless waves, and prayed that their dead would find peace in the depths. Faith became the anchor of their ambition. From these rituals and risks, the empire's spirit took shape. Their leaders rose not from noble bloodlines, but from the sea itself, captains who had faced storms and returned, sailors who had discovered distant lands. Power belonged to those who could read the tides, who could bring fortune from the water's edge. Their rule was not of land and soil, but of motion and courage. The sea was their throne, and their fleets, their crown. Generations later, the world began to speak their name with reverence. Maps once blank were now filled with the routes they had charted. Their flag flew over ports thousands of miles apart. Their coins carried the image of a wave cresting toward the sky. Yet even as their dominion spread, their hearts remained tethered to the same shore where it all began, that lonely line of cliffs where fishermen once dreamed of something more. The sound of hammers still echoed in their shipyards, the cries of gulls still haunted their mornings. Children still stared out at the horizon, their eyes filled with the same curiosity that had sparked it all. The sea was no longer a mystery, but it was still alive, still capable of wonder, still capable of taking everything away. As twilight descended, the reflection of their growing cities shimmered on the surface of the water. Lanterns glowed in the harbors, their light mingling with the stars. From a distance, it looked as if the heavens themselves had fallen into the sea. In that union of sky and water, the empire's destiny seemed unstoppable, a civilization born from the tide, reaching ever outward, unaware that the same waters that lifted them toward greatness would one day rise to claim them again. The dawn of mastery began with the sound of hammers on oak and the smell of tar rising from the docks. The empire's heart no longer beat within the walls of its cities but within its shipyards, where craftsmen shaped the bones of vessels that would carry its destiny. Great keels stretched across the sand like sleeping giants, their curved forms waiting to touch the water. Men worked in rhythm, their hands calloused, their faces bronzed by years of sea wind. Each plank they fastened was not merely wood, it was a promise that the ocean could be conquered through knowledge, precision, and will. Their ships grew unlike any that had ever sailed before. Where once they had drifted with the mercy of the wind, now they learned to harness it. Their sails were woven from new, stronger fibers, their hulls lined with resins that defied rot. The designs changed with each discovery, wider beams for balance, deeper holds for trade, sleeker prows to cut the waves. The ocean, which had once dictated the terms, now yielded slightly to human ingenuity. In hidden workshops lit by oil lamps, navigators pored over maps that shimmered with salt and candle soot. They drew lines across the parchment, imaginary roads through an endless sea. They studied the stars not as distant lights but as coordinates, fixed points in a moving world. Charts were copied by hand, each curve of coastline inked with care, each unknown island marked with a question and a dream. To these scholars of the tide, the sky itself became a map, and the wind a language they could read. It was said that their compasses could find their way even through fog so thick that the world disappeared. Their instruments, carved from bone, brass, and wood, were small miracles of craftsmanship, astrolabes that measured the sun's height, hourglasses that counted the rhythm of waves, and ropes knotted with patterns that told distance by feel alone. Through these inventions, they turned chaos into order. The sea, infinite and unpredictable, began to bend to their understanding. Each voyage now began with ceremony. Sailors stood in silence before the shipwrights, offering small tokens, a coin, a shell, a piece of rope from a past journey. These rituals bound them to the craft and to the ship itself. When the new vessels slid into the water, the crowd cheered, but beneath the noise was reverence. The people believed these ships possessed souls, carved into them by the hands that built them and the prayers whispered into their timbers. Out at sea, these new ships became living things. Their sails caught the wind with precision, their rudders held firm against storms. The sailors learned to move as one, reading the subtle moods of the waves. A shift in current, a change in air pressure, a flock of birds appearing on the horizon, all were signs that the sea spoke, and they were finally learning to listen. No longer drifting wanderers, they had become true masters of navigation. Their expeditions stretched farther than ever before. Where once their ancestors had traced the edges of their own coasts, now they crossed entire oceans. They discovered new lands where the trees dripped with resin, the rivers gleamed with gold, and the air smelled of flowers no one had ever named. Each return brought stories that seemed like dreams, islands where the sand was black, seas that glowed in the dark, creatures so vast their shadows stretched for miles beneath the surface. These tales filled the empire with awe, fueling a hunger for more. In the great halls of the capital, maps lined the walls like works of art. Each red line marked a voyage, each circle a conquest or discovery. The empire's leaders gathered there, their eyes tracing the lines outward, further, always further. To them, the ocean was not an obstacle but an empire of its own, one that could be mapped, measured, and mastered. From the harbors, fleets set sail almost daily. Their banners rippled in the wind, proud symbols of progress, faith, and dominion. The captains who led those voyages were not mere sailors, they were legends. They carried within them the spirit of discovery, patient, fearless, unyielding. Some never returned, vanishing into tempests or the endless blue, yet even their loss became part of the empire's mythology. Children grew up whispering their names like prayers. The empire's poets compared them to the stars they followed, constant and eternal. Their stories inspired others to go further still, until it seemed no corner of the sea remained untouched. Back in the ports, The rhythm of the empire beat louder. Blacksmiths forged anchors that gleamed like silver. Ropes thicker than a man's arm coiled along the docks. The clang of metal and the creak of timber created a symphony of progress. Even the night glowed with lanterns as crews prepared for journeys that could last years. The harbors smelled of oil, wood, and anticipation. The empire had built its strength not on land or conquest but on the courage to sail into the unknown. Yet for all their triumphs, the sea remained a mystery. It revealed enough to encourage belief in mastery, but never all of itself. There were places where compasses spun without meaning, where the stars seemed to shift, where voices echoed across the fog though no ship could be seen. The sailors spoke of waters that felt alive, of waves that rose without wind, of shapes moving deep below that no one dared name. The empire's scientists dismissed such stories, but the old ones listened and nodded, remembering the time when the ocean was still a god, not a possession. In their pursuit of perfection, the empire built the Grand Fleet, a gathering of ships larger than any the world had seen. Their hulls gleamed with carvings, their sails embroidered with gold thread that caught the sun like fire. When they launched together, the sea itself seemed to tremble. From high cliffs, the people watched as the fleet vanished over the horizon, a forest of masts dissolving into light. That sight marked the pinnacle of their achievement, a moment when it truly seemed the ocean had been tamed. But mastery is a delicate illusion. Beneath the surface, the currents still moved as they always had, deep, indifferent, eternal. The empire believed it had unlocked the secrets of the sea, yet every chart, every map, every calculation rested on the assumption that nature would remain predictable. It was a beautiful belief, and it carried them further than any civilization before. Still, the sea kept its final truths hidden, waiting for the moment when it would remind them who truly ruled. For now, though, in this age of innovation, the empire thrived. The shipyards roared with purpose, the stars served as guides, and the ocean seemed endless and welcoming. The world had grown vast, yet somehow smaller, its mysteries replaced by routes, its fears by confidence. The people looked to the horizon and saw destiny written in blue. They did not yet know that beyond that shimmer of light, where their maps turned blank again, the ocean waited with quiet patience, preparing to reclaim what it had once given. The harbors of the empire had grown into living labyrinths of sound and color. From dawn to dusk, the air pulsed with the cries of merchants, the rustle of silks, and the clinking of coins. The scent of spices hung thick, cinnamon, clove, pepper, and smoke, mingling with the tang of salt and the oil that coated every ship's hull. Dockworkers shouted from the decks, ropes groaned as cargo was hoisted high, and gulls circled above, their cries like echoes of fortune. Trade had become the lifeblood of the empire, its arteries stretching across every sea the horizon could hold. Ships arrived from lands so distant their languages sounded like music. Some brought porcelain painted with scenes of faraway mountains, others carried ivory gleaming like frozen moonlight. There were bolts of dyed silk so soft they slipped through one's fingers like water, and gemstones that shimmered with the deep hues of twilight. The markets near the docks overflowed with these treasures, turning the coastal cities into places of wonder. People from inland kingdoms journeyed weeks just to glimpse the spectacle, to see the empire that had turned the ocean into a road of gold. In the heart of the capital, the Great Bazaar stood as the empire's proudest jewel. Its arched corridors were lined with tapestries depicting the sea, each wave embroidered with threads of silver. Merchants displayed wares from every corner of the known world beneath its domed ceilings. The murmur of negotiation filled the air, a gentle rhythm of voices rising and falling like the tide. Gold changed hands, and with it, power. The empire's wealth grew not through conquest of land but through mastery of exchange. But with wealth came hunger. The promise of endless trade began to feed something deeper, a quiet, persistent greed. The same curiosity that once drove explorers to seek new horizons now urged men to count their profits and dream of more. The merchants who once sailed alongside sailors now built palaces overlooking the harbors, their windows glowing like lighthouses of opulence. Their laughter echoed across marble halls, drowned occasionally by the soft sound of waves that seemed to whisper reminders of humility long forgotten. At sea, the empire's ships multiplied. Fleets moved like silver trails across the water, linking distant continents in a web of commerce. Each journey carried riches, but also danger. Pirates lurked beyond the safety of patrol routes, and storms could turn fortune into ruin overnight. Many captains began to travel armed, not only with trade goods but with cannons and steel. The lines between merchant and warrior blurred until every ship was both vessel and fortress. It was said that even the winds seemed to respect their passage. In the taverns near the docks, stories spread faster than ships. Sailors spoke of ports where gold dust blew through the streets, where kings traded crowns for spices, where the empire's flag flew above cities that had never seen its armies. Yet behind those tales, quieter whispers grew. Some said that the wealth came at a cost, that the sea demanded payment for every treasure it gave. Superstitions took root among the crews, never to count coins at sea, never to speak of gold before a storm, and never to forget that the ocean listened. The empire's rulers dismissed such fears. In their palaces of coral-colored stone, they celebrated prosperity with festivals that lasted for weeks. Musicians played beneath lanterns shaped like fish and stars. Courtiers wore garments dyed in shades of the sea, deep indigo, pale turquoise, and silver gray. Servants poured wines imported from distant isles, their sweetness carrying the scent of the tropics. The empire's elite believed they had reached a golden age, a harmony between man and ocean. Yet harmony is fragile when measured against ambition. Far beyond the reach of their feasts, on the outer edges of the trade routes, a different story unfolded. The sailors who braved those distant waters returned with eyes hollowed by fatigue and awe. They spoke of uncharted islands where the trees bled sap the color of fire, and of waters so clear they could see the ruins of cities beneath the waves. They brought back artifacts, coins stamped with faces no one recognized, fragments of pottery older than memory. The scholars of the empire studied them with fascination, unaware that these discoveries hinted at a pattern the sea had written long before, a cycle of rise and fall, of creation and reclamation. As trade expanded, competition grew fiercer. Other nations, envious of the empire's wealth, began to send their own ships into the open waters. The empire responded by fortifying its ports, building naval outposts on remote islands, and demanding tribute from all who crossed its routes. The ocean that once represented freedom was now divided by invisible borders, each wave carrying the weight of law, greed, and control. The empire's reach stretched farther than ever, but so too did its shadow. In the markets, the laughter of merchants was often tinged with anxiety. Prices soared and crashed like tides. Rumors of storms destroying entire convoys circulated with every sunset. Some claimed the ocean itself was rebelling, restless beneath the burden of so many ships. Fishermen began finding strange debris tangled in their nets, bits of gold leaf, fragments of carved stone, relics that seemed far older than the empire itself. The sea was returning what it had once taken, but no one yet recognized the warning. At night, when the noise of the markets faded, the harbors grew quiet. The moon shimmered on rows of anchored ships, their reflections trembling in the still water. A few sailors lingered on the docks, staring into the dark where the sea met the sky. They could feel the weight of it, the silence between the waves, the breath of something ancient watching from below. They knew that for all their wealth and mastery, they remained guests upon the ocean's surface, and that the invitation could end at any moment. Still, morning always came, and with it, renewed illusion. The empire continued to flourish, its coffers heavy, its reputation radiant. The scent of spice and salt filled the streets, and the song of commerce rose again. Every new voyage promised more land, more riches, more glory. And so they built larger ships, chased longer routes, and believed their dominion eternal. Yet beneath the brilliance of trade and treasure, a faint tremor had begun. The same greed that had driven them to greatness was beginning to erode the foundation of their harmony. The ocean, patient and vast, waited. It had seen this before, the rise of pride, the illusion of mastery, the inevitable return to humility. For now, though, the empire's sails still glittered under the sun, its markets still overflowed with abundance, and its people still believed the tides belonged to them. The sound of coins, like the whisper of waves, lulled them into forgetting that every fortune built on the sea must, sooner or later, answer to it. The turning of the empire's tide began not with thunder or war, but with silence. It crept in quietly, like fog at dawn, unnoticed by those drunk on their own prosperity. The merchants still shouted in the bazaars, ships still departed with sails swollen by the wind, and nobles still raised their cups to toast the sea that had made them gods among men. But beneath that surface, something subtle had changed. The sea's rhythm felt different. Its once predictable calm shifted into strange moods, sudden storms in clear skies, currents running backward, waves that rose without wind. Fishermen whispered that the ocean was restless, that the deep had begun to murmur again, speaking in the ancient voice it used before the first ship was ever built. Along the docks, old sailors began to avoid the water at night. They claimed they heard whispers under the planks, soft, persistent, like 1,000 voices just below hearing. Some said it was only the creak of wood and the sigh of tides, but others swore they recognized words. Names, warnings, promises. A few even spoke of shapes moving in the mist, tall, pale figures gliding between the ships, leaving no ripples behind. The younger sailors laughed it off, calling it drink-born fantasy, but none of them lingered long alone near the tide after dark. Weeks turned to months, and trade began to falter. Ships vanished along routes that had been safe for generations. At first, it was easy to blame pirates or storms. But when entire fleets disappeared without a trace, unease spread through the empire. The ocean, once their ally, had become something unknowable again. Merchants demanded answers, priests offered prayers, rulers ordered sacrifices to appease the gods of wind and wave. Yet the disappearances continued. It was as though the sea had begun to reclaim what it had given. In the capital, the rulers gathered in their marble halls, trying to make sense of the growing dread. Scholars pored over maps and old journals, searching for patterns, but the sea followed none. Its movements were erratic, impossible to predict. One night, a massive wave struck the northern harbor without warning, destroying dozens of ships in moments. The survivors described it not as a storm but as something deliberate, a single surge that rose out of nowhere, then vanished, leaving behind silence and debris glittering like tears. It was the first of many such events, each one more violent than the last. Amid this growing chaos, a few began to remember the stories told by their ancestors, the ones dismissed as superstition during the empire's rise. Tales of the sea's ancient kingdom beneath the waves, where forgotten gods slept, their dreams stirring the tides. Stories of civilizations that had grown arrogant before, believing they could tame the ocean, only to vanish into its depths. The parallels were impossible to ignore. But pride is a stubborn blindness. The empire continued to send ships, each voyage an act of defiance, as if to prove that man's will could still command the sea. In the southern provinces, where the coast met endless dunes, strange relics began washing ashore, sculptures of unknown design, metal tools encrusted with coral, fragments of writing that no scholar could decipher. They were relics from the deep, older than history itself. The people who lived there began to fear the ocean's gifts. They built shrines along the shore, leaving offerings of salt and fire, praying that whatever stirred beneath would spare them. The empire dismissed these acts as foolishness, but in private, even the governors avoided looking too long at the water. Then came the night the moon disappeared. Not behind clouds, not in an eclipse, but entirely, swallowed by an unnatural darkness that stretched across the sky. The sea turned still, as if holding its breath. Every ship in the harbor sat motionless, their sails limp. Fishermen said the ocean surface turned black and mirror-like, reflecting not the stars but something vast moving beneath. For 3 nights, no wind blew. No wave broke. And when the moon returned, the tide had receded so far that the seabed itself was exposed, glistening with ruins no one had ever seen before. Curiosity overcame fear. People flooded to the shore, walking among the bones of forgotten cities. Towers crusted in coral jutted from the sand, and stone archways led into tunnels that vanished beneath the waterline. The air smelled of rust and decay. Some explorers ventured inside, returning with treasures, strange coins, crystal orbs that glowed faintly, weapons that hummed like trapped storms. Others never came back at all. And when the tide returned, it did so with fury. The sea rose higher than ever before, swallowing everything it had revealed. The cities near the coast drowned in a single night. Those who survived spoke of seeing lights beneath the water as they fled, shifting, spectral, almost human. Some said they were the spirits of the drowned, others claimed they were the sea's ancient guardians reclaiming what had been taken. Whatever they were, they moved with purpose, illuminating the deep like a heartbeat pulsing from the abyss. The Empire sent ships to investigate, but none of them returned. The harbors fell silent. The Great Bazaar, once filled with the sounds of gold and laughter, became a graveyard of empty stalls. The air that once smelled of spice and salt now carried only the scent of decay and wet stone. Inland, the people began to turn against their rulers. They blamed the emperors and merchants for angering the sea with their greed. Temples were burned, palaces looted. The once glorious banners of trade were torn down and used to patch broken roofs. Fear had become a language everyone understood. The empire, so powerful it had believed itself eternal, now found its lifeblood, the ocean, turned against it. The gods of the deep, long ignored, had woken. Years passed, and the coastline continued to retreat. Villages that once thrived on fishing became deserts of salt. Ships rotted in the sand, their hulls cracked open like bones. Those who remained lived in superstition, refusing to speak the ocean's name aloud. The memory of its wealth became a curse, a reminder of arrogance. Stories replaced history, myths replaced maps. The empire became a ghost that lingered only in the ruins swallowed by the tide. Yet even as everything fell apart, a strange beauty remained. The sea, though merciless, was not cruel. It simply took back what had always been its own. On quiet nights, when the waves were gentle, one could still hear the faint echoes of the empire's past, the laughter of merchants, the creak of masts, the hum of markets, all drifting through the mist like ghosts. Some said it was memory made sound. Others believed it was the sea remembering too, mourning in its own endless way. Far from the ruins, in places untouched by the empire's reach, new sailors began to appear. They built small boats and sailed cautiously, watching the horizon as if listening for permission. They did not seek gold or conquest, they sought understanding. They told each other that the ocean was not a road to riches but a mirror, reflecting what lived in the hearts of those who crossed it. When they cast their nets, they whispered apologies. The days aboard the Empire's great ships began not with the rising sun, but with the whisper of the sea. Even before dawn broke, the decks came alive with the muted rhythm of footsteps, the soft groan of ropes being drawn taut, and the creak of timber responding to the movement of the waves. Lanterns swayed gently in the dim pre-morning light, their glow catching on the salt-crusted edges of barrels and coils of rope. The sailors moved like shadows, silent, efficient, each man and woman part of an unspoken choreography that had been repeated for generations. Sleep was a luxury, discipline a necessity. They knew the ocean respected only those who respected it first. The youngest among them, often barely grown, looked out across the endless stretch of water and felt the strange blend of awe and dread that came with realizing how small they were against such vastness. They had heard stories of what the ocean could do, of tempests that tore masts in half, of ships swallowed whole without a trace. Yet in the still moments before sunrise, when the world was nothing but silver water and cold air, they also understood its beauty. The ocean was alive, a restless, breathing entity that both carried and tested them. Every day it offered the same silent question, "How long can you endure me?" Below deck, life was less poetic but no less vivid. The smell of tar, sweat, and salted meat mingled in the narrow corridors, where hammocks swayed in slow unison with the ship's roll. Here, in the dim light of flickering oil lamps, laughter and curses echoed together. Friendships were forged in the long hours between destinations, bound by the shared hardship of endless horizons. Sailors carved tokens from driftwood, swapped stories of home, and sang songs that spoke of longing for land they might never see again. To live at sea was to exist in a world outside of time, where days blurred and only the rituals, raising sails, mending lines, reading the stars, gave structure to the vast uncertainty of existence. On the upper decks, officers moved with quiet authority. They were the keepers of order, their voices steady even when tempests loomed. To the crew, they represented both hope and fear, hope that they could guide them through the unknown, and fear that their decisions might lead them into peril. These men and women were not untouched by doubt. Every command carried weight, every misjudgment could mean death. Yet they had learned the same truth the sea taught all who crossed it: hesitation was fatal. The Empire's strength depended on their certainty, their composure, and the illusion that they could bend the will of nature to their own. Sometimes, at night, when the stars stretched endlessly above, sailors gathered near the stern and told stories. Some spoke of monsters said to dwell in the depths, creatures that glowed faintly beneath the waves and sang in voices too beautiful to be human. Others told of ghost ships, silent vessels drifting across the horizon, crewed by those who had defied the ocean and paid the price. Whether believed or not, these tales served their purpose. They gave shape to the invisible fears every sailor carried, turning the unknown into something that could be named, perhaps even laughed at. The ocean was mystery made tangible, and to survive it, one had to respect both its reality and its legends. The Empire's ports were worlds of their own. When ships returned, their arrival was announced long before they reached shore. The echo of horns, the slow descent of sails, and the cheer of waiting crowds. Merchants, lovers, and families gathered at the docks, scanning the horizon for familiar faces. For every vessel that came home, another was still out there, lost in the deep silence between continents. The ports smelled of salt and spice, of sweat and coin, of joy and grief entwined. There were tears of reunion and mourning alike, for the sea gave and took with the same impartial hand. Yet amid the hardship, there was a sense of belonging that bound the people of the Empire together. Whether sailor, merchant, or citizen, all shared a connection to the sea, a collective heartbeat that echoed through every harbor and market square. The Empire's identity was not carved into stone but written on the tides, shifting and fluid. Its power flowed through the trade routes, the fleets, and the lives of those who braved the open waters. The ocean had become their mirror, reflecting both their greatness and their fragility. As dusk descended and the horizon burned gold and crimson, the ships would fall silent. The wind softened, the sea calmed, and the crew stood still for a moment, watching the day sink beneath the waves. There was something sacred in those final minutes of light, a reminder that no matter how far human ambition reached, it was always dwarfed by the vast, eternal sea. The Empire ruled the waters, yes, but every sailor knew a simple truth that no king or conqueror could deny: they did not command the ocean. They merely borrowed its favor, day by day, voyage by voyage, breath by breath. The Empire's influence extended far beyond trade and conquest. It flourished as a center of culture, intellect, and creativity, where knowledge and artistry intertwined to produce a society both sophisticated and curious. In grand halls and humble workshops alike, artisans and scholars labored with dedication, producing works that captured the imagination and preserved the wisdom of generations. Libraries, filled with scrolls and manuscripts, became sanctuaries of learning, where astronomers studied the heavens, cartographers refined maps, and philosophers debated the nature of power, humanity, and the world beyond their shores. Every invention, every painting, every carefully written text reflected a society that sought not merely to survive, but to understand, to innovate, and to leave a lasting mark upon history. Festivals and ceremonies brought color, music, and laughter to the Empire's cities and ports, offering moments of respite from the demands of life at sea and the pressures of expansion. Musicians played melodies that echoed through cobbled streets, dancers traced intricate patterns under lantern light, and storytellers recounted myths that intertwined with the Empire's growing legend. These cultural expressions were not merely entertainment; they served as both unifiers and educators, instilling values, preserving memory, and fostering a shared identity that spanned distant lands. Through these celebrations, citizens felt the pulse of the Empire in their veins, their pride and curiosity nourished alongside their joy. Scientific and intellectual achievements flourished alongside artistic endeavors. Astronomers refined instruments that allowed for precise navigation, mathematicians developed calculations that guided engineers and shipbuilders, and inventors experimented with innovations that made ships faster, stronger, and more efficient. Scholars exchanged knowledge with travelers and traders, absorbing ideas from across the known world and adapting them to local needs. The contrast between cutting-edge innovation and the simple, enduring rhythms of village life illustrated the empire's remarkable balance between progress and tradition, sophistication and humility. The architecture of the empire's cities reflected this duality. Port towns featured fortifications and docks designed for both commerce and defense, while palaces and public buildings showcased elegance, symmetry, and grandeur. Temples and academies rose alongside bustling marketplaces, creating an environment where spirituality, learning, and daily life existed in harmonious proximity. Walkways were lined with mosaics, courtyards with fountains, and the walls themselves often depicted stories of past triumphs, heroic voyages, and legendary figures. The physical space of the empire mirrored the intellectual and artistic vitality of its people, creating a tangible expression of culture that inspired awe in visitors and pride in citizens. Even as the empire expanded across seas and continents, its cultural achievements remained intimately tied to human experience. Music, literature, and art captured not just the grandeur of power, but the fragility of life, the humor in daily toil, and the wonder of discovery. Scholars and artists alike chronicled the exploits of explorers, the challenges of sailors, and the subtle beauty of the natural world, ensuring that the empire's legacy would endure not only through maps and wealth, but through the stories, ideas, and dreams of its people. In this way, the empire became more than a force of trade or conquest. It became a beacon of human curiosity, creativity, and aspiration, a testament to what can be achieved when intellect, imagination, and ambition converge. The ocean had long been the empire's most loyal servant, but now it seemed to whisper to others too. Across the horizon, sails the color of blood and bone began to multiply. What had once been a tranquil, uncontested expanse was now a chessboard of ambition, its waves carrying the scent of challenge and the promise of violence. The empire's merchants were the first to notice. They returned from distant ports with uneasy stories, new ship designs gliding faster through the currents, rival captains who spoke the empire's tongue with disarming fluency, and flags rising over harbors that once pledged fealty to the old maritime order. There were murmurs of an alliance forming to the west, of ports that refused imperial tax collectors, of smaller kingdoms joining forces under banners that bore symbols of the sea serpent and the sun, marks of power that mimicked the empire's own. In the Grand Council chamber, carved of coral and ivory, admirals and governors gathered under the flickering light of whale oil lamps. Their faces were carved with fatigue, eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. They spoke of missing fleets and intercepted trade routes. Reports from scouts described islands fortified overnight, where once there had been fishing villages. The emperor, though outwardly calm, felt a tide rising that even he could not command. The rival powers had studied well. They had learned from the empire's shipwrights, copied its navigation maps, and mastered its maritime codes. Where the empire had once sailed with unmatched confidence, now its convoys were shadowed by unknown vessels that seemed to appear from mist and vanish before pursuit. What began as mere interference soon evolved into a deliberate campaign. Cargo ships vanished mid-journey, their wreckage later washing ashore like warnings. To counter this, the empire expanded its navy, galleons bristling with iron, manned by sailors who swore oaths to guard the ocean routes until their final breath. But expansion came at a cost. Timber reserves dwindled, coin drained from the treasury, and resentment grew among coastal provinces taxed beyond endurance. Yet the empire could not slow its pace. To yield the sea, even for a moment, was to admit weakness. Still, the empire's commanders underestimated the new threat's cohesion. They assumed the raiders were scattered bands, opportunistic pirates. But beneath the chaos lay organization. A confederation of maritime states had bound themselves together in secret pacts. They called themselves the Tideborn. Their fleets were leaner, their weapons adapted for speed and maneuverability, and their commanders were unburdened by the rituals of hierarchy that slowed imperial response. By the time imperial intelligence grasped the truth, the Tideborn had already captured key outposts along the eastern archipelago. From these bases, they disrupted the empire's spice convoys and pearl expeditions. Trade with distant continents faltered. The once steady hum of port cities turned uneasy, fewer ships arriving, fewer coins exchanged, more talk of what might be coming. The empire's admirals convened again, charting counteroffensives. Maps spread across tables showed dotted lines of old trade routes now severed by hostile patrols. The youngest admiral, barely 30, suggested a bold maneuver to strike deep into Tideborn waters, destroying their ports before they could solidify control. Others, older and wiser, warned against it. The enemy knew these coasts better, and the empire's charts were decades old. But desperation dulled caution. The emperor, urged by pride and pressure, approved the mission. The fleet departed at dawn, 60 ships strong, sails gleaming like ivory wings. Drums thundered across the harbor as thousands watched from the shore. Mothers clutched their children, veterans stood with stoic eyes. The people needed to believe the empire still ruled the waves. As the last ship vanished into the horizon, a silence settled over the port, heavy, expectant, fragile. For days, the fleet sailed unopposed. The winds favored them, the sea was calm. Spirits rose. They believed the stories of the Tideborn had been exaggerated. But on the seventh night, the ocean turned against them. The wind shifted sharply, carrying the stench of smoke and pitch. From the darkness, fires bloomed across the water, small at first, then multiplying like stars. Enemy ships, low and narrow, moved swiftly through the gloom, their hulls painted black. The empire's vanguard barely had time to raise alarms before the first volley struck. Flaming arrows arced through the night. The impact was thunderous, sails ignited, decks splintered. Imperial captains shouted orders, trying to maneuver their heavier ships, but the wind betrayed them. The Tideborn used the storm as their ally, weaving through the chaos with precision. Smaller, faster, and more coordinated, they struck the empire's flanks and vanished into the mist. By dawn, the ocean was littered with wreckage. Half the imperial fleet was gone. Survivors drifted on makeshift rafts, eyes glazed with disbelief. Among them, the young admiral stared into the distance, replaying every decision, every order. He had believed the empire's reputation would be enough to secure victory, but the sea had chosen differently. When news of the disaster reached the capital, it arrived like a curse. The court went silent. The emperor, once so composed, dismissed his council and sat alone before a vast map of the world. His trembling hands traced the borders that once stretched unbroken across oceans. Now those borders felt like illusions, fading lines drawn on shifting water. But the empire could not afford mourning. Another fleet was assembled, smaller, faster, commanded by veterans who had survived earlier wars. They swore vengeance, though privately they feared the same fate. The Tideborn, it was whispered, had learned to read the sea in ways the empire never had. Some said their navigators could sense currents by touch, their captains could predict storms by scent. Myths grew around them, feeding dread among the imperial ranks. And yet, amid the growing threat, a deeper arrogance remained. Many within the empire still believed their destiny was divinely tied to the ocean, that no rival, no storm, no alliance could truly unseat them. The emperor clung to that faith as if it were armor. But faith, when tested by the tide, can drown as swiftly as any man. The sea had begun to change in ways few could understand. For generations, it had been a faithful companion, a realm of mystery but also of opportunity. The sailors of the empire believed they knew its moods, its tempers, and its secrets. But now, something subtle had shifted. The winds came later in the season, unpredictable and fierce. Currents that had guided trade routes for centuries began to wander. Storms rose from calm horizons with unnatural speed, swallowing ships whole before word could reach the ports. The ocean that had once carried the empire's wealth now seemed to conspire against it, eroding the confidence that had long been its anchor. At first, the empire dismissed these changes as coincidence. Seasons varied, tempests came and went, and ships were always at risk. But soon, the losses became too frequent to ignore. Entire fleets vanished into the mist, their fate whispered about in coastal taverns and the dim-lit halls of the Admiralty. Maps once considered flawless were redrawn, only to fail again. The navigators, men who had prided themselves on their skill, began to falter in their certainty. And with each lost ship, the empire's pulse weakened just a little more, as if the sea itself was reclaiming what it had once lent. In the harbors, a strange quiet took hold. Dockworkers whispered of omens, strange lights seen beneath the waves, ghostly songs carried by the wind. Fishermen, who had braved these waters since childhood, refused to sail beyond the reefs. Some claimed the ocean floor had shifted, that vast cracks had opened in the deep. Others said the gods of the sea, long appeased with offerings and rituals, had grown impatient with human arrogance. These superstitions, once dismissed by the empire's scholars, began to find sympathetic ears even among the learned. Fear was seeping upward, from the harbors to the palaces, from the sailors to the throne itself. The emperor, a man who had inherited both glory and burden, found himself surrounded by uncertainty. Reports arrived daily, of lost ships, of failed harvests, of uprisings in distant colonies. The sea, his greatest ally, was now the empire's most unpredictable enemy. Advisors debated endlessly over how to respond. Some urged caution, others boldness. Expeditions were launched to study the changes, to uncover new routes or understand the shifting tides. But many of these missions never returned. The sea swallowed them as easily as it had swallowed the fleets before them. The empire's vast network, once its greatest strength, had become a web of fragile threads stretched across a restless expanse. In the coastal cities, life began to change. Once bright markets now seemed subdued, their songs of trade and celebration replaced by murmurs of unease. The smell of salt and spice still hung in the air, but beneath it was the sharp tang of anxiety. Families waited for news of loved ones lost to the ocean. Merchants who had built fortunes upon the empire's maritime power began to hoard gold rather than risk it on new ventures. Shipwrights, who once crafted proud vessels for conquest and exploration, found fewer commissions. The empire's ports, once throbbing with energy, now carried the hollow rhythm of decline. But not everyone surrendered to despair. Among the sailors and scholars, there were those who refused to accept that the sea could not be understood. They studied the skies, the stars, the subtle tremors in the tides. They built instruments to measure the movement of water and wind with unprecedented precision. Some believed that the ocean was merely entering a new phase, a natural cycle that, if mastered, could restore balance. Others whispered that the empire had angered forces beyond comprehension, that pride and greed had drawn the wrath of the deep. This tension between science and superstition, between faith and reason, mirrored the empire's own struggle to reconcile its past glories with its uncertain future. In one of the empire's great observatories, perched on a cliff overlooking the roaring sea, an old astronomer watched the horizon through a polished glass lens. Night after night, he recorded the changing positions of stars and the subtle variations in tides. What he saw disturbed him deeply. The heavens themselves seemed to drift, as though the very balance of the world was shifting. He sent word to the capital, a warning that something fundamental was altering the course of nature. His message, like so many before it, was filed, debated, and forgotten. But the sea did not forget. It roared louder, higher, closer with each passing season. The empire's great cities began to feel the consequences. Floods that once came once a generation now returned every few years. Coastal defenses crumbled under waves that seemed to grow taller each season. In some regions, entire settlements were abandoned. The once glorious lighthouses that guided ships home became monuments to futility, their beams reaching out over empty waters, searching for ships that would never return. As the tides crept higher, the ocean began to swallow the very edges of the empire. Roads were drowned. Farmlands turned to salt. Temples built to honor the sea gods stood half submerged, their stone carvings eroding under relentless waves. And still, the people clung to hope. They rebuilt walls, raised docks higher, and sent out fleets to chart safer routes. For a while, it seemed possible that the empire might endure, that human will could still outmatch the rising tides. But beneath that resilience was exhaustion, not the sudden kind born of battle, but the slow, grinding fatigue of a civilization fighting against inevitability. The ocean, vast and indifferent, did not rage in vengeance. It simply continued its rhythm, reclaiming inch by inch what had once belonged to it. There were whispers in the final decades of strange discoveries, ruins found beneath the waves that mirrored the empire's own architecture. Divers returned with tales of marble columns and sunken streets, of statues staring up from the depths. Some said it was proof of an older civilization, one that had risen and fallen before them, swallowed by the same sea that now threatened their world. Others dismissed it as myth. Yet those who looked upon the ocean with clear eyes could not help but see the pattern, the rise, the triumph, and the slow return to silence. In the capital, the emperor aged quickly. The weight of responsibility carved deep lines into his face. He would stand on the palace balcony overlooking the inner harbor, watching as fewer ships sailed each year. The once bustling waters now shimmered with emptiness. He could feel it in his bones, the empire's pulse slowing, its breath growing shallow. Ministers still spoke of recovery, of new strategies, but he knew those were words meant to comfort, not to cure. The sea had shifted, and with it the world that his ancestors had built. The final years were marked by a strange quiet. No great wars, no dramatic collapses, just a slow unraveling. The empire that had once commanded the ocean now barely dared to cross it. Trade routes withered, colonies fell silent, and the map of their dominion began to shrink. In the villages that dotted the coast, old sailors told stories of the empire's golden age to children who had never seen a ship larger than a fishing boat. The empire's meteoric rise, fueled by ambition, skill, and daring, eventually began to strain under the weight of its own grandeur. Its territories spanned continents, its fleets crossed oceans, and its trade networks connected distant shores in ways unimaginable just a few generations earlier. Yet the very expansion that had ensured its dominance now revealed vulnerabilities. Governors and admirals, once loyal and efficient, began to act independently, prioritizing local interests over centralized command. Communication across vast distances was slow, leaving crucial decisions delayed, and small errors in judgment magnified into crises that could ripple across the empire. The intricate balance between ambition and administration required constant attention, and even the slightest lapse could have cascading consequences. The human element, once the greatest strength of the empire, now introduced tension. Officials jostled for influence, merchants competed fiercely, and naval commanders vied for prestige, often at odds with one another. Decisions were no longer purely guided by strategy or necessity but were colored by personal ambition, pride, and rivalry. Resources, though vast, were finite, and the empire's reach sometimes exceeded its capacity to govern effectively. These internal pressures created fractures that outsiders could exploit, and even minor rebellions or mismanaged expeditions carried the potential to undermine years of painstaking effort. The contrast between the empire's projected power and the growing strain beneath the surface became increasingly stark, foreshadowing challenges that money, innovation, or skill alone could not always resolve. Overextension compounded these difficulties. Fleets sent on distant expeditions faced longer, more dangerous voyages, often operating far from resupply or support. Supply lines stretched thin, and ships at the edges of the empire's influence sometimes encountered resistance they could not overcome. Naval engagements that once seemed routine became high-risk undertakings, where miscalculations or misfortune could result in devastating losses. Economic pressures mounted as ports struggled to sustain distant outposts, and the once profitable trade networks occasionally faltered under the weight of conflict, piracy, or natural disaster. The empire's ability to respond rapidly was hampered, revealing the delicate, almost precarious, nature of global dominance. Cultural and administrative cohesion also faced tests. The farther the empire expanded, the more it had to reconcile diverse populations, languages, and customs under a single authority. Local traditions sometimes clashed with imperial directives, creating friction that required diplomacy, patience, and subtle negotiation. Failure to manage these tensions could lead to unrest or even rebellion, challenging the very notion of centralized control. Meanwhile, the centralized bureaucracy struggled under the burden of oversight, its reach impressive yet imperfect, leaving gaps in governance that opportunistic rivals and internal factions were quick to exploit. Yet in the midst of these emerging vulnerabilities, the empire continued to project an image of strength and invincibility. Its ships sailed with confidence, its ports remained bustling centers of trade, and its cultural achievements flourished. The contrast between this outward appearance and the subtle cracks within only heightened the tension, creating a narrative in which triumph and fragility coexisted. The seeds of decline were sown not in a single failure, but in the cumulative effect of ambition, overreach, and the human imperfections inherent in any vast endeavor. In this delicate interplay between power and peril, the empire's story became increasingly complex, a tale of brilliance shadowed by the quiet onset of fragility. The empire's golden age, once radiant and seemingly eternal, began to dim in slow, almost imperceptible stages. It did not collapse with the drama of a single battle or the shock of one fatal decision, but rather eroded like a shoreline under the unceasing tide. What had once been unity became a patchwork of competing ambitions, a vast web of interests held together less by loyalty and more by necessity. The grand councils that had once governed with vision now descended into debate and indecision. Voices that once spoke in harmony grew discordant, each advocating for survival in a world that was subtly shifting beneath their feet. The empire, for all its grandeur, began to turn inward, consumed by the very weight of its own complexity. In the harbors that had once roared with the sounds of industry, change could be felt in the silence between the tides. Fewer ships came home fully laden, and the docks that had been alive with laughter and work began to echo with uncertainty. Sailors told of routes no longer safe, of ports lost to storms, of foreign powers asserting new control over the seas. The merchants, who had once thrived on endless movement, now faced shortages and delays that no amount of planning could fully counter. The wealth that had once flowed like water through the empire's veins now slowed, pooled, and stagnated in the hands of a few. The once boundless ocean, which had carried the empire's dreams, began to feel hostile and distant, an expanse no longer conquered, but endured. In the great cities, the signs were quieter but no less telling. Temples still glimmered with gold, and palaces still glittered under torchlight, yet beneath the surface lay discontent. The people, long accustomed to prosperity, began to feel the strain of scarcity. Taxes rose and trade regulations tightened, but even these measures could not restore the easy flow of wealth that had defined earlier generations. Scholars debated in candlelit halls, trying to understand the subtle patterns of decline, while poets whispered laments for the age that seemed to be slipping away. The empire's image of perfection had begun to crack, and through those cracks seeped doubt, fear, and nostalgia for a past that already felt unreachable. The navy, once the embodiment of imperial pride, faced its own reckoning. Ships that had once ruled the waves with unmatched precision now struggled against rivals who had learned from their successes. Enemy fleets, smaller but more agile, began to outmaneuver the empire's heavy vessels. The intricate network of ports and resupply stations that once guaranteed efficiency was now fragmented, plagued by corruption, neglect, and the sheer exhaustion of overextension. Even the shipbuilders, masters of their craft, faced shortages of timber, metal, and skilled labor. The mighty fleets, symbols of control and confidence, became ghostly shadows of their former glory, sailing more to defend what remained than to claim new horizons. For the sailors who still braved the waves, the sea no longer felt like an ally. Storms seemed to grow stronger, currents more unpredictable. Superstitions, once dismissed by officers, began to creep back into everyday speech. Men whispered of omens, unlucky birds, blood-red sunsets, and ghostly lights on the water. The ocean's moods became a metaphor for the empire itself, vast, mysterious, and increasingly beyond comprehension. Yet amidst this uncertainty, there remained moments of breathtaking beauty, sunsets that turned the horizon to gold, quiet nights when stars reflected on calm waters like scattered jewels. It was as though the world itself mourned the empire's fading brilliance, offering fleeting glimpses of serenity before the next storm arrived. Beyond the shores, rival nations stirred. They watched as the empire faltered, testing its defenses with probing attacks, exploiting weaknesses long hidden beneath its facade of invulnerability. Where once fear of reprisal had kept them at bay, now opportunity beckoned. New alliances formed, and trade routes once monopolized by the empire began to shift into foreign hands. The old balance of power was dissolving, replaced by a world that no longer revolved around a single dominant force. To its rivals, the empire's decline was both an opening and a warning, a testament to the impermanence of supremacy and the way all greatness eventually bends beneath time's unrelenting tide. Within the empire's heart, the cultural pulse still beat, though faintly. Artists painted with melancholy beauty, chronicling the splendor of days past. Musicians composed elegies that carried both sorrow and pride, while storytellers spoke of the early explorers and the first ships that had ventured into uncharted seas. In their art, the people sought both solace and understanding, weaving memory into legacy. Yet even this revival carried a bittersweet tone. The more they celebrated the past, the clearer it became that the future no longer promised the same magnitude of wonder. The empire's greatest strength, its boundless curiosity, had turned inward, reflecting on what had been rather than what might still be. Corruption crept quietly through the institutions that once stood as pillars of integrity. Positions once earned through merit were now bought or traded. Decisions were made not for the common good but for private advantage. The spirit of exploration and innovation gave way to self-preservation and greed. Bureaucrats delayed vital reforms, fearing the loss of their privileges. The empire's brilliance, once fueled by unity and shared vision, dimmed beneath the weight of cynicism and complacency. The ocean that had once symbolized limitless possibility now mirrored this decay, its surface still shimmering, but its depths concealing the wreckage of forgotten ambition. As decades passed, storms, both political and literal, grew more severe. Uprisings flared along the empire's farthest edges, and provinces that had once thrived under imperial guidance now demanded independence. In response, the central authority tightened its grip, sending fleets and legions to restore control. But each act of suppression drained resources further, spreading the military thin and deepening resentment. The empire's reach, once its greatest weapon, had become its weakness. Its leaders could still command the seas, but not the hearts of those who lived upon their shores. What began as a series of small fractures widened into chasms that even the strongest ruler could not bridge. Amidst this turmoil, nature delivered its own final reckoning. A cataclysmic storm struck without warning, vast, unrelenting, and unlike anything seen before. Entire fleets vanished in its fury, swallowed by waves that seemed to rise from the depths themselves. Coastal cities were flooded, harbors destroyed, and thousands of lives lost in a single night. When dawn broke, the ocean was eerily calm, as if nothing had happened, but the empire was forever changed. The storm was not merely a disaster of weather. It was a symbol, a manifestation of all that had gone unheeded, the arrogance of unchecked ambition, the blindness of power, the inevitability of nature's supremacy. In the aftermath, the survivors looked upon their broken world with awe and disbelief. As the years slipped quietly into decades, the empire's decline did not come with sudden collapse or dramatic defeat, but through a slow, almost imperceptible unraveling. Like an old tapestry fraying at its edges, its grandeur remained visible from a distance, yet up close, the loose threads were impossible to ignore. Trade, once the lifeblood that connected distant continents and filled the empire's coffers, began to falter. Rival ports emerged along newly charted coasts, offering faster routes and cheaper goods. The empire's merchants, once unrivaled in skill and daring, now faced competition that eroded profits and prestige alike. Routes that had once been celebrated as triumphs of navigation became perilous as storms grew fiercer and pirates more audacious. The once predictable rhythm of maritime commerce was replaced by uncertainty, And every voyage carried a question mark where there had once been confident expectation. Whispers of decline echoed quietly through the markets and shipyards. Sailors returning from distant expeditions spoke of ports that no longer pledged loyalty, of governors who minted their own coins, of captains who defied the chain of command to pursue private profit. The empire, stretched across vast distances, began to lose its cohesion not in open rebellion but in quiet indifference. People did not declare independence, they simply stopped listening. Bureaucrats in the capital sent orders that arrived months too late to matter. By the time responses came, the circumstances had already changed, the world having moved on without them. This slow disconnection between center and periphery became the silent heartbeat of decline, pulsing softly beneath the surface of daily life. The sea itself seemed to mirror the empire's fading vitality. Where once ships sailed in proud formation, bearing banners that gleamed in the sunlight, now fewer vessels ventured forth. Dockyards grew quieter, their once clattering forges now idle or repurposed. The scent of tar and salt that had defined the bustling ports was replaced by the musty stillness of abandonment. Wooden hulls, left untended, began to rot, ropes frayed, sails tore, and the echoes of hammer strikes on hulls faded into memory. The ocean, which had once carried the empire's glory across the world, became a silent witness to its exhaustion. And yet, decline rarely appears tragic to those living within it. Life continued. Markets still opened at dawn, and fishermen still cast their nets into the same waters. Children played in the streets of coastal cities, unaware that the grandeur surrounding them was fading. Scholars continued to write, artists continued to paint, and priests continued to bless voyages that no longer promised riches but still carried the weight of tradition. The empire did not collapse in flames. It exhaled slowly, surrendering its dominance with a weary dignity. The causes of decline were debated even then, and historians would later argue endlessly about them. Some blamed the erosion of discipline within the navy, the loss of the fearless spirit that had once made their fleets unstoppable. Others pointed to the corruption that had seeped into the bureaucracy, where officials lined their pockets while the empire's infrastructure decayed. Still others believed the empire's fall was written in its very success, that expansion had carried it beyond the limits of sustainability, that no human institution could stretch so far and still remain whole. The truth, perhaps, lay in the convergence of all these forces. A chain as strong as the empire's could still break if enough links weakened at once. In distant provinces, forgotten harbors began to fall into disuse. Crumbling lighthouses stood like gravestones against the horizon, their fires long extinguished. Storms battered the once thriving coastal settlements, eroding both stone and memory. There were no reinforcements, no repairs, only the slow reclaiming of human effort by time and tide. The ocean, vast and patient, began to erase the traces of empire one wave at a time. And yet, in certain places, remnants endured. The foundation of an old dock here, a fragment of carved stone there, each whispering stories to those who cared to listen. For the sailors who remained, life became a cycle of survival rather than triumph. They spoke of the old days with reverence and sorrow, remembering when their ships had commanded respect across every horizon. Now, their vessels sailed shorter routes, often for smaller patrons, their once proud flags replaced with tattered remnants of forgotten glory. The songs they sang were slower, heavier, filled with longing rather than celebration. In taverns along the ports, old mariners would gather to recount stories of the empire's golden age, of battles fought on open seas, of discoveries that had changed the map of the world. But beneath the laughter and rum, there was always silence when the stories ended, a silence that said more than any words could. Meanwhile, nature continued its quiet work of reclamation. The great harbors silted up, coral crept over the remnants of once mighty piers. Forests advanced inland, reclaiming the land where shipyards had stood. The sea, too, gave back what it had taken. Wrecks surfaced after storms, carrying within them relics of a world that had once believed itself eternal. Divers found coins fused together by salt and time, amphorae still sealed with traces of ancient cargo, anchors encrusted with coral, their iron bent but not broken. These relics told stories of resilience as much as decay, of human ambition that dared to challenge eternity, and of the inevitable surrender that followed. In the capital, the change was subtler but no less profound. Palaces once alive with the bustle of foreign envoys and admirals now echoed with emptiness. The great council chambers saw fewer debates, fewer triumphs to celebrate. The monarchs of this late era still spoke of destiny and renewal, but their words carried the hollow tone of ritual rather than conviction. Statues were polished, banners replaced, ceremonies performed, but the vitality that had once animated these gestures was gone. The people, loyal but weary, no longer looked to the horizon for promise. They looked inward, to their own survival. And yet, in this slow descent, there was a kind of melancholy beauty. The empire, even in decline, had shaped the world irrevocably. Its maps, its trade routes, its languages, its art, all had left their mark. Other nations, once students or rivals, now built upon its legacy, adopting its methods and improving upon them. The world moved forward, but always carried within it the faint echo of the empire's greatness. In this way, decline was not an ending but a transformation, one form giving way to another as the ocean reshaped the shore. Generations passed. Children grew into adults who had never known the empire at its height, yet they inherited its remnants, the architecture, the customs, the myths. They walked through streets whose names still whispered of ancient admirals and legendary voyages. They gazed out to sea and saw not the promise of conquest, but the quiet dignity of endurance. In their eyes, the empire became something larger than politics or power. It became a story, a living memory of what humanity could achieve when it dared to challenge the impossible. Even centuries later, sailors would speak of the empire with a mixture of awe and sorrow. Some claim to have seen ghost ships drifting silently through fog, their sails glowing faintly beneath the moon, carrying the spirits of those who had once ruled the waves. Others said the ocean still carried the echoes of distant drums, the faint rhythm of a fleet long vanished beneath the depths. Whether truth or legend, these tales endured, passed down through generations like prayers to the sea, a way to remember and perhaps to mourn. The empire's ruins became sacred places, visited by scholars, poets, and wanderers seeking to touch the remnants of greatness. Stone pillars encrusted with shells, fragments of mosaic floors, and weathered inscriptions became relics of a civilization that had once believed it could command the ocean. Standing among them, visitors often felt an inexplicable stillness, a sense that the air itself remembered. It was not merely history they encountered, but the lingering spirit of ambition, courage, and loss intertwined. In the end, the empire was not destroyed by enemies or consumed by a single catastrophe. It was absorbed, slowly, gently, almost lovingly, by the very ocean it had once mastered. Its harbors filled with sand, its cities sank beneath rising tides, and the songs of its sailors were carried away by the wind. The sea did not rage or rebel, it simply reclaimed what was always its own. And somewhere beneath those waves, perhaps still intact in the silence of the deep, lies the memory of a civilization that dared to dream beyond the horizon. The story of the empire that ruled the ocean is not one of failure, but of inevitability. All great powers must one day yield to the cycles of time. But few have done so with such grace, with their spirit carried forward in the tides, their influence lingering in every ship that sails, every compass that points north, every dreamer who gazes across the sea. For even in its fall, the empire achieved something immortal. It taught the world that the ocean cannot truly be conquered, only understood, respected, and revered. Its end was not a vanishing, it was a return. The sea had given birth to its greatness, and in time, it received it back, completing a circle as old as the world itself. When the end finally came, it did not arrive with thunder or spectacle, but with a silence that was almost reverent. The empire that had once ruled the ocean, whose banners had flown from distant shores, whose fleets had commanded awe and fear alike, faded not in fire, but in the quiet retreat of tide and time. Its harbors, once crowded with masts and sails that blotted the horizon, grew still. Docks fell silent, ropes frayed, warehouses emptied. Salt winds carried only the creak of timbers and the whisper of forgotten songs. The sea, once an ally and servant, reclaimed what had always been its own, swallowing piers, fortresses, and even whole towns into the vast, indifferent blue. What was once the empire's lifeblood had become its shroud. In those final years, the people who remained could feel the weight of decline pressing against them like a fog that refused to lift. Traders spoke in hushed tones of routes gone unsafe, of ships that never returned, of rival flags rising where once only their own had flown. Families who had built their fortunes on maritime trade found themselves ruined, their fleets either lost to storms or captured by competitors. Towns that had once thrived on the empire's global network dwindled into obscurity. Markets that had once glittered with foreign goods now offered only the bare necessities. The empire's pulse slowed, and with it, the rhythm of life that had once seemed eternal. For those born into the final generation of imperial rule, the grandeur of the past was something almost mythical. They heard stories from elders of cities gleaming under the sun, of great ships whose decks seemed to stretch endlessly, of gold and spices that flowed like rivers from distant lands. But those stories belonged to another time, to another people. The world they knew was quieter, dimmer, filled with echoes rather than triumphs. Where once the empire's flag had been a symbol of unity and pride, it now fluttered over empty harbors, its colors faded by years of salt and wind. The power that had once made oceans tremble was now a memory, fading further with every passing tide. Nature, ever patient, began its slow reclamation. Coral grew over the remains of sunken ships, weaving them into vibrant underwater gardens. Fish swam through the skeletal ribs of what had once been mighty vessels, turning instruments of conquest into sanctuaries of life. Shorelines shifted, burying ruins beneath layers of sand and sediment. Forests crept over abandoned settlements, roots prying apart stone walls and consuming what humans had built. The ocean, impartial and infinite, smoothed the scars of empire, leaving behind only the faintest traces for future generations to uncover. The sea had taken back everything, quietly, methodically, without malice, without triumph, just as it had given in the beginning. Yet even in the empire's disappearance, something of it endured. The people it had touched, those who had sailed under its flag, traded through its ports, or lived in the shadow of its influence, carried fragments of its spirit within them. Techniques in navigation, shipbuilding, and governance survived in distant lands, absorbed into new cultures. Words, customs, and stories once born in imperial ports traveled far beyond the empire's reach, merging with local traditions and giving rise to new identities. Though the empire itself had vanished, its echoes rippled outward through history, invisible yet indelible, shaping worlds that would never know its name. Archaeologists centuries later would uncover its remnants, broken amphorae, rusted anchors, coins bearing the faces of forgotten rulers. From these fragments, they would reconstruct the story of a civilization that once commanded the seas, marveling at both its brilliance and its fall. But even their discoveries would be incomplete, mere hints of a greater reality lost to time and tide. The empire's heart, its people, their voices and fears and triumphs, all of that had dissolved into the vast continuum of history, leaving only whispers beneath the waves. To stand at the shoreline centuries later, listening to the wind, was to feel a faint presence, as though the ocean itself still remembered. There is something profoundly human in the empire's rise and fall, a reflection of our endless desire to reach beyond our limits, to build monuments against impermanence, to believe that what we create might endure. The empire's story was not one of failure, but of inevitability. All things that rise with such brilliance must eventually yield to time. The same forces that drive discovery and ambition also carry the seeds of exhaustion. Empires, like tides, follow rhythms beyond human control. They surge, crest, and recede, each leaving behind traces of beauty, tragedy, and wisdom. The ocean that swallowed this empire did not destroy it. It simply carried it onward into memory, into myth. In the twilight of its reign, when all hope of restoration had faded, a few chroniclers still wrote by candlelight, trying to preserve what could be remembered. They recorded not only victories and conquests, but the quieter truths, the exhaustion of sailors, the fear before storms, the longing for home that even power could not silence. They wrote of the empire not as a machine of dominance, but as a living thing, vibrant, flawed, magnificent, mortal. Their words, fragile as parchment, would one day survive longer than the ships or cities they described. Through them, the empire would achieve a kind of immortality, not in stone or steel, but in story. As centuries passed, the empire became legend. Children in faraway lands heard tales of a civilization that ruled the seas and then vanished beneath them. Scholars debated its causes, poets romanticized its fall, and sailors invoked its memory when venturing into uncharted waters. Its name, once spoken with authority, became a symbol of both grandeur and humility, a reminder that no dominion, however vast, can escape the turning of the tides. Even the ocean, in its ceaseless motion, seemed to echo the lesson that power is transient and that beauty often resides in the fleeting. Standing on the shore where it all began, one could almost imagine the ghosts of ships gliding silently across the horizon. The sun would dip low, painting the waves in hues of gold and crimson, and for a moment, it would seem as though the empire still lived, its fleets returning, its ports bustling, its people singing to the rhythm of the sea. But as night descended, the illusion would fade, leaving only the endless sound of water and wind. The empire was gone, yet somehow present, existing now not in the world of men but in the endless dreaming of the ocean itself. Even now, when historians trace the contours of lost civilizations, the empire that ruled the ocean stands apart. Its end was not born of a single conquest or calamity, but of something deeper, a reminder that all human endeavors, no matter how grand, are bound by the same laws of nature and time. The ocean's depths became its archive, the tides its memory, the silence of the seabed its final resting place. Yet from that silence came resonance, for the empire's story endures precisely because it was lost. Its beauty lies not in survival, but in surrender. Long after the empire's banners had faded and its fleets had vanished beneath the waves, whispers of its glory persisted in distant harbors and among the ruins of its once great cities. Travelers spoke of colossal stone docks now claimed by coral and tide, of towers half submerged where gulls nested in what were once halls of power. The ocean, vast and unrelenting, had become both tomb and storyteller, its currents carrying fragments of pottery, coins, and memory to faraway shores. Fishermen sometimes hauled up relics from the deep, ornate carvings, bits of armor, coins imprinted with faces whose names had been forgotten, and wondered what kind of world had existed before the sea reclaimed it. The empire lived on, not through power or conquest, but through echoes and artifacts, reminders of how greatness can dissolve into myth. Generations passed, and with them came new rulers, new maps, and new names for the lands and waters the empire had once known. Yet beneath every ship that crossed those same routes lay the silent ghosts of its predecessors. Sailors told stories of phantom lights flickering on the horizon, of spectral fleets glimpsed in fog, of voices carried faintly by the wind. Whether born of superstition or truth, these tales became part of seafaring lore, a living connection to a time when humankind had dared to challenge the vastness of the ocean. Even as centuries transformed reality into legend, something about the empire's spirit remained in the salt air, in the rhythm of the waves, in the yearning of every sailor who gazed toward the horizon. Scholars and historians later sought to reconstruct the empire's history, piecing together fragments from old manuscripts and sunken ruins. In their studies, they found not only evidence of technological brilliance and political reach but also a portrait of humanity at its most ambitious and vulnerable. They wrote of its rise as a triumph of intellect and courage, and of its fall as an inevitable reckoning with nature, hubris, and the limitations of mortal endeavor. The empire's story became a mirror held up to every civilization that followed, a reflection of the same desires, fears, and contradictions that define the human condition. Its history was no longer just about conquest and collapse, but about the eternal cycle of creation and loss, progress and humility. In time, poets and storytellers transformed those facts into legend. They spoke of a kingdom that had mastered the waves, that had built ships like floating cities, that had harnessed the power of wind and tide as if it were divine. In their telling, emperors became demigods, navigators became heroes, and the ocean itself became a conscious force, sometimes benevolent, sometimes vengeful. Listeners, lulled by the rhythm of the words, felt the line between history and myth blur until it no longer mattered which was which. What endured was the feeling, the awe, the melancholy, the quiet recognition that all human greatness eventually returns to the same deep silence from which it rose. And yet, the sea kept its own counsel. Beneath its shifting surface lay the ruins of harbors and cities, the bones of ships once considered indestructible, and the traces of lives that had shaped the world in their time. Coral grew over carved stone, turning monuments into reefs. Fish swam through the remnants of palaces. Sunlight filtered through the water, illuminating mosaics that told forgotten stories. The ocean, eternal and impartial, continued to move in rhythm with the moon, erasing borders and preserving memory in equal measure. It had swallowed the empire, but in doing so, it had also given it a strange kind of immortality, transforming it from a nation of men into a myth that would outlast every map, every flag, and every name. So the empire that once ruled the ocean was, in the end, ruled by it. The same waters that had carried its dreams and riches became its resting place, and the same winds that had filled its sails now whispered through ruins and open waves. Yet in the hush of dawn, when the light first touches the sea and the horizon glows like molten gold, one can almost imagine the silhouette of a ship emerging from the mist, a reminder that nothing truly vanishes, that every rise and fall leaves ripples across time. In that quiet moment, the empire lives again, not as a power or a nation, but as a story eternal as the tide.